Welcome back to the Point of Order podcast, an inside look at California politics and the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and I'm joined today by a returning co-host, Assemblymember Vince Fong from Assembly District 32 in Bakersfield. Welcome back, Vince.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are embarking on our last 3 weeks, I guess now, or by the time this podcast comes out, 2 weeks left of legislative session. What are your general feelings about the end of session and kind of I don't know, you're just, how you feeling?
Well, the end of session is always a chaotic time. I think you and I are kind of in the same boat of shared pain. Like what are the last minute deals? What are the last minute bills that are going to get jammed through the legislature? And how are we going to communicate that with the public? And we see this now with this unemployment insurance, the proposal to give it to striking workers. We're seeing a lot of these labor bills. I mean, we have an insurance proposal that's trying to stabilize the insurance market. All of these things are happening, but as you said before, I mean, we've got a couple weeks left, and speed is not our friend when you try to develop policies in such a quick manner.
Yeah.
The outcome is normally not good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm actually hearing, and you're the vice chair of our budget committee as well, but I'm hearing there's still some remaining budget bills that we have to vote on, despite the fact that we supposedly passed a budget back in June.
Well, this is obviously the result of what happens when you have rushed bills, and the budget is one of the biggest examples. So you've got a lot of bills. I've never heard of the phrase cleanup language or cleanup bills until I got elected to the legislature. But a lot of these bills are going to clean up mistakes that were made in earlier budget proposals. But again, you've got a budget bill and 10 trailer bills that were introduced in the dark of night, and now we're scrambling to try to figure out what's in them. Things that affect community college funding, things that affect the state's going to get more involved in the production of drugs, which is going to disrupt the market when it comes to medicine. You've got more debt that the state is going to force a lot of agencies to incur by forcing them to take on bonds. And these have tremendous implications, not only to our fiscal health in California, but for all taxpayers.
Yep.
Because, if there's more debt or if there's more spending, who's going to pay for it? It's going to be Californians. And so, we're just trying to hold everyone accountable. And right now we're digging through tons and tons of proposals. Yeah.
Is there anything of interest in these budget bills that you're aware of yet, or is it just
Well, I mean, there is a lot of fees that are going to be increased.
Okay.
That's a big problem for us. And then I think the one that we're trying to get more specifics on is what's impacting our local community colleges.
Okay.
I think the state of California, the governor's proposal is to claw back some of the student housing money that was provided to community colleges, and then in exchange, because of our challenges fiscally, they're going to kind of push the community colleges to take on bonds and to take on more and to borrow more.
Wow.
So, I mean, talk about an empty promise. In previous years, we gave community colleges funding to build more student housing, and then now they're saying, hey, all that money that we gave you to build student housing, we're going to take it all back, and we're going to make you take on more debt. And that's not fiscally responsible.
That's crazy. The borrowing, well, that's actually a good transition into kind of our weekly recap. One thing that you and I have been talking about on the theme of borrowing is that, the legislature has passed a number of bonds, basically asking voters to borrow billions of dollars over the next few years, really the next few decades probably. And there was an editorial in the SAC-B this week that kind of talked about this. We've got proposals this year on education infrastructure, another school bond essentially, a flood protection bond. We have a fentanyl eradication bond proposal. That's $5 billion. I think that flood protection one is in the $6 billion range or something like that. The education one is obviously like huge. It's 15 billion or something. You've got a housing bond. You've got a mental health expansion bond. You've got climate change response bond. You have a farming sustainability bond. I mean, how much debt are we actually going to be asking voters to take on?
This is a very frustrating debate when we have it in the legislature, and you're in it with me. But California's budget is on an unsustainable path, and bonds are more debt. I mean, we know about debt when we buy a house or we borrow for a car, and this is no different. So California has a spending problem, and the revenues into the state are coming in less. We see that with the slowing economy. If you look at the projections over the revenue compared to projections last month, I think the revenues coming into the state was $1 billion less than projected. Wow. So the economy is definitely in a precarious situation. So the way that the governor tried to address the deficit that we have in the budget that we discussed and that was jammed through was he made some cuts, but he shifted a lot of that spending to bonds.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got all these other bond proposals. So if you aggregate all of these bonds, we're looking at over $100 billion.
That's insane.
Of bonds. And of course, we have to pay that back. So not only do you have to look at the cost of the bond, but what's the debt service? What's the interest and everything else that the state is going to obligate?
And that comes out of the general fund for the most part.
Absolutely.
So
so you look at like the budget we had, $310 billion. You don't think we could have invested some of that money into fentanyl prevention?
Yeah.
That we could have used some of those resources to invest in housing, to invest in water storage, all the things that they want a bond for. We could have paid it through the general fund with the resources we had. But because of the misplaced priorities the governor and the Democrats had, they pushed all that money to those misplaced priorities, and then now they're going to force Californians to pay for more bonds. Hypothetically, if the voters
would have to approve,
voters have to approve for it.
It just seems like a terrible time to be going to voters with these requests. I mean, obviously, people love schools, people love, obviously a lot of these priorities, flood protection. People care a lot about mental health, right? But it seems like a terrible time to be going to voters and asking for this sort of commitment and this sort of, spending increase, essentially.
Well, it's a hard choice because the voters are asking, wait, why didn't you invest in those things first? So before we ask the voters to go and take on more debt, maybe we should look at our own budget and say, you know what, flood protection is important. We just dealt with massive rain and snow and the most recent tropical storm. Well, don't you think that we should invest those things? If it's our top priority, then we should make it a priority in the budget, not just set it aside and just take on more debt for it.
Well, yeah, it just seems like we're constantly asking for more. Like it's never enough. We're constantly going back to the taxpayer and saying, we just need more money and that'll solve these problems. When in reality, I mean, I think that we're probably wasting a ton of money in our current budget and we're not spending the money we are spending efficiently. I mean, you and I have talked about homelessness and the billions we're spending on that with negative results, right? Like, I mean, it's just we spend and we spend and we spend.
And that's a great point. You look at homelessness spending and the fact that we needed to be doing audits and you led the charge on that. But, the mental health services reform that the governor is asking for is tied to bonds. Yeah. So there's a big push for the counties to offer more services and all these unfunded mandates.
Yeah.
And then and the way that those mandates are going to be potentially funded is through bonds. Well, what happens if the bonds don't pass?
Yeah.
So then all our counties are forced to deliver services, needed services for sure, and the state forced them to do it, but then there was no resources tied to it. I mean, and again, we're all paying for it, and of course, people need help, but they're not going to get the services, and counties are going to be forced to make tough decisions because the state Sacramento wasn't responsible.
Yeah. It just seems like we're constantly asking for more money, and we're doing very little to to fix our own problems.
We got to get our fiscal house in order, and and we can do it. I mean, that's the thing. Like folks like you and me, like if we sat down and said, okay, let's have an audit and a hearing on every single agency in California, and what are you using the money for? And before we bond, let's look at your budget first.
Yeah, for sure. One of the I think top examples of government waste might be the EDD, the Employment Development Department. There was a big story that came out this week. The state auditor has this list of high-risk state agencies in California, basically the agencies that are most at risk and that are, not acting in a responsible way. They added the EDD to their list this week. That was announced in their report.
I'm shocked that it took so long.
Right?
I mean, we probably thought it should have been on that list from the very beginning.
I mean, it should have. I mean, and then you look at what happened during COVID. We had $30 billion in fraud through the EDD, unprecedented fraud across the nation. And in addition to that, you have now an $18 billion debt in our unemployment insurance fund to the federal government that our employers, our small businesses, are going to be the ones that have to pay back over the next decade, probably, right? And so we have literally created this problem for our small businesses that they're going to have to pay back in the form of a payroll tax, and it was purely created. I mean, certain people are going to blame COVID. This was created by irresponsible actions by the EDD, and not a single other state is facing this problem. I mean, that's the reality. Just us. So
I mean, there's no way to defend the EDD. I mean, this is not the first audit. I mean, this is again another frustration. This is not the first audit that has indicated that the structural flaws of this department. And then, as you mentioned before, the fund is insolvent. We've got so much debt. Our employers are going to be right now on the hook and we shouldn't, and they shouldn't be. We should have paid off this debt when we had a surplus. But as you mentioned before, out of all the states in the country, only California and New York have massive debt left. Yeah. Every other state has paid off its debt. So we have a lot of work to do. This is definitely, I mean, to call it a high risk agency is an understatement, and we're going to have to really, dive into their operations and fix it.
Yeah. So the state auditor in their report said EDD is unable to reliably estimate improper payments under the UI program, thus adversely affecting the state's financial statements as well as impairing efforts to independently evaluate the efficacy of EDD's own fraud prevention activities. I mean, the crazy thing about this is that they gave out money that they shouldn't have given out. And then you had a ton of people that were eligible for money, that were applying for it, that couldn't get money because of some issue with their verification system. And so you had hardworking Californians getting rejected. Literally, our offices, were the ones that the Assembly and the Senate offices were the ones that were working to get money for our constituents that they deserved and that they needed. Meanwhile, you've got people in prisons getting EDD dollars fraudulently. I mean, the whole thing is backwards.
If you look at the definition of government failure, I think this is the prime case study. And the EDD is a complete mess. The governor certainly has failed in trying to fix this agency, and we're beyond strike teams and more bureaucracy and more. I mean, we have the evidence. I mean, every single audit that's been done has outlined all the things we need to do. We just got to now do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extremely frustrating. I will shift gears here to kind of our weekly, story on retail theft and organized crime. So Dick's Sporting Goods came out and basically said that retail theft is to blame for a pretty substantial decrease in profits for their chain. It's funny. It's not funny, but it's interesting that it was Dick's Sporting Goods that put out this statement, because actually the Dick's Sporting Goods in my city in Folsom got basically robbed, and a giant, loss just in the store in my city. But I mean, just kind of adding to this trend of retail theft that we're seeing across the state every single week, there's a new story. And so, I just thought that was an interesting one to bring up.
These stories are constant. These videos that we're seeing on social media, these smash and grabs. I mean, whether it's Southern California, the Central Valley, San Francisco. I mean, you've got malls closing because of the crime and organized retail theft. And the challenge is that the governor announced that he's going to triple the CHP presence in LA. Yeah. Well, that's only dealing with the symptom. The Glendale Police Department arrested one of the suspects for that they believe was involved in one of the smash and grabs. Released on the same day, on zero bail. I mean, so again, these are the real world consequences of all of these soft on crime policies pushed by the ruling party up here. And we have to address Prop 47, reform Prop 47, 57, AB 109. I mean, all the things that you've been talking about. I mean, the public is waking up and they want something to change, and we have to increase penalties on criminals, and we have to give our law enforcement and district attorneys more tools to go after.
Yeah, well, and to hold people accountable. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I actually did an interview this morning with Comstock Magazine, who's actually doing a big story on Proposition 47 right now, and looking at what it's going to take to actually, make a change there. And a lot of the questions were related to, why doesn't the Assembly Public Safety Committee pass any reforms? Yeah. And we got into that whole discussion.
Well, we have to be the adults in the room. I mean, we have to look at the data. We have to look at the information that's being provided by our law enforcement and district attorneys. I mean, Prop 47 isn't working. I mean, if you aggregate all of the losses, I mean, we're looking at over $1 billion in losses as a state. I mean, you look at the major retailers and then the small businesses. Yeah. And then these aren't victimless crimes. I mean, imagine you taking your kids to the Nordstrom and all of this happening, or people getting robbed, or walking to their car in the parking lot. I mean, we go to the stores now, everything's locked up, or the stores are empty because you can't put anything on the shelves. I mean, we're seeing this everywhere.
Yeah, it's I part of me believes that if the voters were given an opportunity to change something this time around, if it got a fair title and summary, which is a big if, that they would happily vote to change Prop 47 or repeal it.
And there's talk now of, the California district attorneys have put an initiative, submitted it to the Attorney General. It would reform Prop 47. It would deal with fentanyl. It would deal with homelessness and the causes when it comes to drug addiction and mental health. So, if the legislature is not going to act, I think the voters are going to have to. We have to go directly to the voters, and they're going to have to send a message like enough is enough. And I think they're telling us that.
And this is the beauty of our system in California is when the legislature is not doing its job, the citizens can step up.
Assuming the Democrats don't try to game the system, we see that with the ACA 13 now, where there's an initiative, they don't like it, so now they're going to try to move it around or increase the vote thresholds.
That's a fair point. ACA 13 is one that. I know it's not on our list today, but it's
something to talk about. You could do a whole show on ACA 13 and just all the games that's played up here.
So summarize ACA 13 for me. So is that the one that would basically say if you want to put anything on the ballot with a 2/3 tax, requirement, that it would have to be passed with a 2/3 vote?
So there's an initiative that was qualified, and the Taxpayer Protection Act, and it was to increase the thresholds for all taxes, whether it's local or state, to be a 2/3, and that was to protect Prop 13. That was to protect the taxpayers across the board. And any tax that was imposed by the state legislature would go to the voters for their say. Well, the Democrats don't like that, so now they're going to say, well, that initiative, only that initiative. Now, instead of allowing it to be voted on and passed by a majority, now they're going to say, well, we're going to change that, and we're going to say now your initiative, before it takes effect, has to be passed by 2/3.
So 2/3 of voters.
2/3 of voters now have to approve it to allow it to go through. And the thing is that this is now, I mean, this is how frustrating it is because, I mean, the Democrats have the control and up here in Sacramento, but now they're just putting their thumb on the scale. They don't even care what the voters say.
Yeah.
They're gonna say, well, you know, the rules of the game that in terms of like how initiatives should be passed, like we're gonna change it just for this initiative, not for any other tax initiative, just for this one.
The thumb on the scale thing, I think, is what's most upsetting. I mean, because it's not the first example, right? And I just mentioned title and summary. I mean, I feel like the majority party or whoever's in power in the Attorney General's office is constantly putting their thumb on the scale on initiatives because they have the ability, a partisan office has the ability to write what the voters look at, the title and the summary of all these initiatives. That's why Proposition 47 was named the Safe Schools and Neighborhoods Act, even though it did the exact opposite of making our neighborhoods and our schools safer. And so, I think that is something that's just not talked about enough.
It's terrible process. And this is the thing. Our state has a very rich history in direct democracy. People can argue that, but at the end of the day, we get elected by the voters, and we trust the voters to make the right decisions. So now, all of a sudden, if the ruling party doesn't like a proposal that's before the ballot, like they're going to give it a bad title and summary, they're going to increase the voter thresholds, they're going to change everything to make it as difficult as possible. Yeah. And that is antithetical to the concept of direct democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole point of our initiative system is to do what the legislature is unwilling to do.
Exactly. And let the voters decide. We make our case to the voters and we let them choose.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we'll see how those fare. So last note in our recap, there's a new leader has been selected in the Senate that I think probably won't take over until next year.
I think they're working out the transition.
Yeah. But Senator Mike McGuire has been elected by his colleagues to be the pro tem in the Senate, taking the place of Tony Atkins, who was previously the Assembly Speaker and then went over to the Senate and quickly became the pro tem of the Senate, leading that body. So, I think it's just an interesting note. I don't even know if I have any real thoughts on it, other than it seemed a little cleaner than our recent Assembly Speaker battle. Right? They got pretty messy.
We had some chaos on the Assembly side. I think theirs was a little bit smoother transition. Look, we'll see. I mean, any new leader that comes in has opportunities and challenges. The Senate, to your listeners, I mean, they got more progressive over the last few years, and so as our partner on the other side of the House, our hope is that he'll just try to bring some common sense and balance. We'll see.
Do you have hope in that? I mean, do you think that he's a little more balanced or?
Well, I don't know.
Moderate.
Time will tell. I mean, I would say this: the only predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and so I'm gonna be a realist here and say that things change dramatically. Probably not, but at the end of the day, we make policy in the world of politics, and I hope that he'll have an open mind and he'll listen to all sides. Yeah. I mean, that's what we've been asking for. And at the end of the day, let's let common sense prevail. Yeah, no, I think that is definitely the hope. Interestingly, he terms out in 2026. So, I mean, this is I feel like a very short-term pro tem. Exactly. And then you have another cycle, and then we're going to be talking about this again in a couple years, probably. So, I thought that was interesting that they didn't choose someone with a little more longevity, although I know he has the respect of a lot of his colleagues, obviously. But, it's just it's an interesting thing because it's just we know it's going to be short term. Yeah, really. Exactly. Right? So what is he going to try to do? What are his priorities? I mean, what can you do in 3 years? And right? I think we got to figure that out. Yeah, or 2 even. So it's going to be really interesting. Hopefully we'll be able to, our new speaker, their new pro tem, be able to work together on some things for the betterment of California. Right. Time will tell. We're all problem solvers. I mean, you've definitely established yourself as that, as someone who just focus on solving problems in our state. That's what we all are trying to do. And at the end of the day, we hope that they'll be open-minded and pragmatic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most we can hope for right now. All right, shifting gears to our segment where we're looking ahead at what we're going to be discussing over the next few weeks in the legislature. The big one really off the top has been, for years has been wildfires, insurance, obviously cost increases, but in a lot of districts, non-renewals, especially particularly in districts with, high fire risk. We've seen a lot of Californians losing their fire insurance. We've seen insurance carriers leave the market in a number of cases. Really, really major shifts in this world that are not sustainable. And so there is talk that there's going to be a bill, or there is a bill, I should say, but there is negotiations going on a bill to at least somewhat address this issue. Yeah. What have you heard about kind of this end of session plan, I guess, or proposal to address our insurance crisis, and do you think it's going to make a dent?
Well, as one of the new members on the insurance committee, I've definitely been thrown into it. But as you've indicated before, you've described it perfectly. It's an insurance crisis, and this has been intensifying. This hasn't just happened. As someone who represents current ancillary counties, high fire areas in our modern communities, but I feel like all of California is kind of a high fire area right now in terms of what we're dealing with when it comes to catastrophic wildfires. And so, the insurance commissioner, because of his inaction, has just allowed chaos to ensue and this crisis to intensify. And so the insurance carriers that are providing insurance, they're leaving the market. State Farm announced that they're not going to issue any more policies. Farmers has pulled back a little bit. Everyone's now kind of been forced into the FAIR Plan. The FAIR Plan has become insolvent because all of those. It's prohibitively costly, right, for a lot of Californians. So you force the FAIR Plan, which is capitalized by the insurance carriers. You force them now to incur all the costs. These catastrophic wildfires are getting massive. Adverse selections happening. And so you have an unstable FAIR Plan. Yep. You've got not enough carriers in the market, and so you can see how all of these things are interacting. And the one entity that is responsible for managing and keeping stability in our insurance market, the insurance commissioner, elected by the voters, has not done his job. Yeah. And so now we're scrambling to try to stabilize the insurance market. They're trying to get this proposal done in 2 weeks. Yeah. And so the framework is constantly changing. So we'll see. I think once we get the proposal, you'll have another podcast on it, and we'll have to dive deeper into it. But this is a tough one. Yeah, it's a really tough one. I think there's a lot of Californians that are. I hear about this a little less in my district, but even in my district, there are folks that are getting non-renewed. Yeah. And really, whenever you see a market shift like this, whenever you see giant providers, pulling out of a market like this, it really increases the cost on everybody. And you need and we need certainty. You just can't, all of these decisions that are made when it comes to the market. They're market dynamics. So, using catastrophic modeling, we're the only state that doesn't allow it. Yep. Reinsurance, we're the only state that doesn't allow that part. And so incorporating those into decisions, getting more data, fixing the choke points in the market and within the insurance commissioner's office. And this is a huge lift. It is a huge lift. I think the big question on a lot of people's minds is, can we recover from what we've allowed to happen? And it has to work. And you can't just, we can have all these negotiations and conversations, but will the insurance carriers re-enter the market? Right. Will the FAIR Plan be stabilized? That's what, at the end of the day, we are in a results-oriented business. Yeah. And so if there's this big proposal that's going to happen, the obvious question that everyone should ask ourselves and every Californian is, okay, is it going to work? Because there's no point in having this exercise if it's not going to stabilize the market.
Yeah, well, and I feel like the longer we've let it go on, like the worse it's become, and the longer you wait to take action, I mean, the harder that hit is going to be, to fix the problem, right? So, our colleagues in the Senate Republican caucus sent a letter to the insurance commissioner, I think last week, and they talked about the hard truths that need to be addressed, and so their list was, rate adjustments, reinsurance, and prospective catastrophic modeling needs to be authorized, which is what you just mentioned. The rate review process needs to be accelerated. Insurance discounts for home hardening need to be authorized. We need to modernize our market. I mean, this isn't on the home insurance necessarily, but on the car insurance side, I've talked to the insurance carriers about the technology that exists to really more accurately predict risk that we do not allow in California. We don't allow those technologies to be used. And so I think there's so many things that we could do as a state to modernize our insurance industry and our insurance market, but we haven't been willing to do that. And so I think we need to have this conversation this month, because if we wait until next year,
it's only going to get worse.
I'm really worried. Yeah,
that we're
going to have to do some. It's going to be even harder, right? So
I had this conversation with with another legislator, and he said something very interesting. He's like, the problems we're dealing with, they're not new,
right?
But as more time goes on, they become larger and more intense. You look at our insurance crisis, you look at homelessness, you look at public safety, you look at rising gas prices. We warned the governor about all of these problems, and we warned probably the previous governor of,
right.
of all these problems.
Right.
As all these policies are layered on top of each other, you're going to make the problem worse. And they all ignored every expert. They ignored all the warnings. And now we're at a point where everything's at a crisis. California is in crisis right now. And now we're trying to figure this out and fix it.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's, future podcasts will report back on the results of these discussions, but definitely an important conversation to have. I think the last thing in this segment that I wanted to talk to you about is we've got a big appropriations suspense deadline coming up this week, September 1st. Actually, the day this podcast is probably going to come out. Okay. So this will be somewhat timely, hopefully, and we'll know more results that day. We also have a big press conference tomorrow morning that's going to happen before this podcast airs on some of these bills. But, there's some pretty major public safety legislation in the Appropriations Committee that we're keeping an eye on, that I would advocate needs to be held in the in the Appropriations Committee and not move forward to the floor. But a few of those. So we've got this bill, SB 553, that would basically require employers to create an extensive violence prevention plan, require them to hire security guards, install alarms, create alert systems, just all kinds of put the onus on employers and businesses
for the consequences
to
of
respond
all
to
the
the
bad
policies that we have passed in this state that have made this retail theft and this crime so serious. We have a bill, SB 94, that would allow an individual sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, basically to apply for resentencing to be able to become eligible for parole. I mean, the people that get this level of imprisonment, I mean, the crimes that you have to commit for that to happen is
pretty bad. They're heinous.
Is heinous. So, and then lastly, SB 81, that would expand the early release of inmates by basically creating a presumption that every inmate should basically get parole with very limited exceptions. I mean, these are all taking us more down the road of, the policies we're already seeing, the detriment, the consequences of. So, I'll be at the press conference. Hopefully you're, I know that we're both in line on these, but I'm just, it's like, when is this going to end?
I mean, we have to stop the insanity.
Yeah.
I mean, you've talked about how like there are just no consequences anymore. And we see the what's happening in our society where criminals are thumbing their nose at law enforcement and our district attorneys and our laws in general. And then, so what's the response by the ruling party up here? Well, we're just going to even let more people out, and we're going to have even laxer consequences this is insane. So we're gonna watch. I mean, we're all watching the suspense file very, very closely. For those who don't know, it's like legislative purgatory.
Yeah,
it's there, and then the appropriations chairs can either let the bills out or not. And so,
it's supposed to be based on cost and fiscal constraints. I mean, any bill over $150,000 cost in the assembly gets held on the suspense file by default. But so much of this is political, it's very behind the scenes. Like, we don't know what conversations are happening behind the scenes.
I mean, these are the bills we want held and stopped. Yeah. But there are some, you and I are supporters of SB 14 to make if you traffic a child, that should be a strike. We should increase the penalties to the utmost when it comes to someone that's going to traffic a human being. We want that bill to get out. Now, who knows what's going to happen there? But we're pushing really hard to get that out. We hope it doesn't get watered down with any amendments. But I mean, this is probably the craziest thing. Is like a bill to increase penalties on trafficking of a child that's struggling to get out of committee, and then all these bills to allow people who are in prison for life to let them out. Like, that's how clear of a contrast can that be of misplaced priorities by the Democrats up here?
Yeah, and I think our constituents and Californians are going to reap the consequences if these bills do pass. And I think just the hypocrisy of putting the kind of all these requirements on small businesses and companies to protect themselves against this rising retail theft that we're seeing.
You're meeting with small business owners. I am too. They're like, they're pleading with us. And okay, we're getting crushed by people stealing everything in our stores. Yeah. And instead of dealing with that, you're going to put the burdens and the responsibilities on us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
incredibly frustrating. Crazy. Yeah, it is. So we're gonna, we've got this big press conference tomorrow morning, Thursday morning. So again, this episode will release after that, but the other bill we're going to be talking about besides SB 14, which is the human trafficking penalty increase that we want to pass, we would like to see these three Senate bills stopped. Yes. But the final bill we're going to be talking about at the press conference is ACA 4, which is actually a constitutional amendment that would allow convicted felons to vote while still in prison. And that would have to be approved by the voters. I'm not convinced the voters would approve that, but the fact that we're even considering sending it their way, I think, again, it's just another example of misplaced priorities.
Yeah, I mean, the honor of voting is reserved for those who are rehabilitated and don't commit serious crimes. I mean, that have lasting effects on our communities. And the idea that we're gonna do this is, I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So we'll report back on those. The fate of all those bills, or a lot of those bills, will be decided. And
that's just the tip of the iceberg. I
mean, how many bills are on the suspense file? Probably
we're looking at probably 1,000 if you aggregate
hundreds in each house, right? Yeah. So it's it's pretty substantial. So moving on to our Just for Fun segment. You weren't at the legislative softball game.
I because of the tropical storm, I got a late start, so I missed the softball game.
Were you gonna play in it, or were you just gonna watch?
I was probably gonna watch. I missed all the practices, and my fear is always I don't want to be that member that gets hurt. Because I was like, a lot of times, like we played the soccer game. We played the legislative soccer game, and I think we do a better job of like stretching and preparing ourselves, warming up for soccer. For some reason, softball, we just think, we're just gonna warm up our arms, and then we never warm up our legs, and then people get hurt, pulling a hamstring or rolling an ankle. And
I just wanted to quickly recap it because last week I talked to Heath Flora about the game because we both were going to play in the game.
He hit for the cycle, I heard.
He did have a very good game, yeah. But it was Northern California versus Southern California legislators, and Northern California won 17-16. with a walk-off single in the ninth. So it was a very exciting game. But we had a bet. Heath and I had a bet last week on the over-under on injuries, and we both agreed on 2. And there were exactly 2.
You nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah, we got it right. So it was Assemblymember Matt Haney dislocated his hip. I mean,
saw the photo.
He couldn't even walk. It was brutal.
Oh.
And I feel for him. I mean, the moment it happened, it was kind of a freak accident. And then Assemblymember Damon Connolly fractured his ankle in warm-ups, taped it up, didn't really realize it. Yeah. He taped it up right before the game started, thinking he just rolled it or something. Fractured it in warm-ups, played on it the whole game, and then found out he broke it. It was just like, I mean, my gosh, these are some serious.
Yeah, there's always a few every single year. These are probably the 2 of the more serious ones. But man, yeah, we're not as young as we probably pretend to be.
But yeah, had to report back on that bet because it was Heath was right on that. But moving on here to our clip of the week, and this will be our final segment. I wanted to play a bit of a speech that our colleague, Assemblymember Devin Mathis, gave recently, and he was actually on the podcast a few weeks ago too. But we had a resolution this week where we talked about suicide prevention and mental health and the importance of advocating for these causes and making sure people are getting the help that they need. So we'll play this video and then we'll talk a little more.
You all know I got a Purple Heart. You know I was injured in combat. Some of you I've shared. Then when I came home to nothing but my car. My accounts were in the red. The VA handed me a cocktail of pills. Here's a bag of pills. Thank you for your service. I was 25 years old. I was told I had a body of an 85-year-old man. Here's a bag of pills, son. Thank you. That cocktail of opioids and uppers and downers that I was given messed me up. With all the other emotional distress of being back, of wondering why God let me live through that to come home to what I came home to. And I had an attempt where I tried to take my own life.
So that's just
very emotional speech. Yeah, I mean that was an emotional session. I mean, to hear Assemblymember Mathis share his story, to hear Assemblymember Pellerin share her story. I mean, powerful. I mean, certainly. More people need to share their stories about how suicide has affected their lives, and we need to certainly focus more on mental health. And I mean, yeah, that was a very heavy session, but glad that a lot of these folks kind of put it out there and kind of remove the stigma of having that conversation.
For sure, and I think these are conversations these are stories that are going to lead to conversations that need to be had on, where our dollars are going in terms of Mental Health Services Act. There is a proposal to, I guess the governor's pushing a proposal to reform how Mental Health Services Act dollars are spent. I think, it's a tricky issue. I think Politico reported this last week or recently that, in recent negotiations, his initial proposal had required, certain spending on substance abuse treatment. That has now become optional, I guess, in the proposal. I think the bill number, I don't have it in front of me here. Let's see. Bill number is SB 326 by Senator Eggman. But, curious about your thoughts on that discussion, but just like where our state needs to head. I mean, I think we spend billions of dollars, especially when it comes to homelessness, right, on housing. But I don't think we put nearly enough towards resources that actually help people
Well, when it comes to, we talked about
issues.
this earlier, and hearing these stories. I mean, you just never know where people are, and just the need to invest more in mental health prevention or mental health services and suicide prevention.
Yeah.
We have to prioritize that. And you have these proposals that are beginning to shift resources from one bucket to the other. In the housing in the homelessness space, there's been this big push like we need to spend more on housing, and while many people would agree with that, the housing component isn't on it by itself. You have to have the housing plus the services. So if you don't have one or the other, then are you actually are you being effective? And I think when I've talked to my county, so all of a sudden, and I think this is where there's been this big push for more flexibility. It's like, okay, well, now you're shifting money into this housing bucket, but all of these critical services that we're providing when it comes to counseling and drug addiction services and mental health services, well, how do I sustain that?
Yeah, how do we fund it?
You've got all these programs that are in your community and my community that are doing a tremendous job, but now I got to make a kind of a Hobbesian choice. Do I continue that funding, or do I have to shift it to something else?
Yeah,
and that's I think an unfair choice to give to behavioral health directors and to our counties and cities.
Yeah. No, it'll be an interesting conversation to follow. I think it's an important one. I think in his speech, Assemblymember Mathis made the point that it's great to talk about suicide prevention and to share stories, but at some point you got to take action, right?
Yeah.
And you have to address the opioid crisis. You have to address getting people help.
Yeah. And the mental health challenges they cross ages, they cross demographics. Certainly we hear the challenges of our veterans and the need to get them services or the trauma they've seen. We see this in our youth from the pandemic and with the impacts a lot of times on social media, what they're and everything they're bombarded with in society. There's challenges that we have to invest in our mental health the needs of our children. You've got it expands our whole entire society.
That is the crazy thing, right? Our veterans have needed this support for a long time, and for obvious reasons, and I think they deserve it more than anyone. But then you had the pandemic that really, I think, accelerated a lot of these problems across the board, particularly when it comes to kids. Kids really took the brunt of the pandemic, what I would call, problematic pandemic policies that kept their schools closed and things like that for far too long. They really took the brunt of that as well. So we have to. And
we're all dealing with it. You're a parent of a teenager now and some younger kids. I have friends of mine that are parents of teenagers and younger, and a lot of the effects we won't see until maybe later on.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, that's going to wrap it up. Do you have any final thoughts before we take off here?
We just got a few more weeks before the end of the session. We just got to work hard and try to keep the public as informed.
Exactly.
This is the value of this podcast is it allows the public a glimpse of what we're dealing with up here in Sacramento.
Well, and there'll be lots more to talk about over the next couple of weeks for sure.
It's an understatement of the day.
So we'll be back next week. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. Please follow along on Spotify and Apple Podcast. You can subscribe on YouTube. And you can follow us on all the social media outlets, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Facebook at Point of Order Pod. And then you can follow Vince and I. My Twitter account is Joshua_Hoover. And then Vince is at VFong. So, hey, Vince, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me again.
It was great having you back.
Of course.
And we'll talk again soon.
All right. Look forward to it.
See you later.